This presentation is for Chapter 13 of the Criminological Theory, Context, and Consequences book. And this chapter covers routine activity theory and some other rational choice-based theories. This group of theories is probably the most practical set of theories in terms of what they try to address. Routine activity and rational choice, for the most part, don't really deal with the issue of the criminality of a person or why they commit the crimes they do in the same way that other theories do. These theories are really more aimed at trying to understand why crime occurs from a more practical perspective. And you'll understand what that means as we get a little bit more into it. But the theories in this chapter, for the most part, assume that offenders are active thinking participants in their criminal enterprises and they have choices to make and they make those choices. Those ideas are not part of the theory necessarily. They're mostly underlying assumptions. It's just assumed that that is the case. Some broad categories we'll look at. One is opportunity theories. And all this really says is that if there's no opportunity for a crime to be committed, then it can't occur, regardless of how badly someone wants to do it. If there's no opportunity, then it can't happen. Most criminological theories take opportunity for granted, and a lot of theories kind of have as their underlying assumptions that the opportunity for crime is everywhere. We don't really need to concern ourselves with that. Opportunity theories would disagree with that, and they would say, well, we can affect opportunity, and the opportunity can be modified so that we can reduce crime. It's not just that it's everywhere all the time and there's nothing we can do about it. Rational choice theory talks more about people choosing crime for their immediate gratification, rather than doing something else of a more long-term focus, and we'll get more into that. So for these theories, crime occurs within the context of the everyday lives that offenders and victims lead. These activities that we engage in and day out, we leave our house, we go to school, we go to work, whatever it is. A lot of these theories argue that it's those routines of people's lives that determine what their likelihood is to be victimized or to become involved in criminal activity. So these kinds of approaches have really practical kinds of policy implications in terms of reducing crime. The most notable is what we call situational crime prevention. And this is this is simple things like lock the doors in your car when you leave it unattended. That's situational crime prevention. So these kinds of theories actually kind of lead to those types of consequences and those types of policy implications. So looking at this group of theories, one of the things they specify is that opportunity is a necessary condition for any specific crime to be committed. And so when we look at the distribution of crime in an area or a neighborhood, these theorists would argue that it's the distribution of opportunity that explains, how crime is distributed in a particular area. High crime areas simply have more opportunity, they would argue, for crime to occur. One of the most well-known theories in this area is called routine activities theory. It was developed by Marcus Felsen and Lawrence Cohen. And so for them, decreasing opportunity is the way you would reduce crime. One of the reasons these types of theories have become very popular is because they really are devoid of any heated political debates. When you start talking about theories like social disorganization or even low self-control theory and things like that, you can very quickly get into very heated political arguments about what we can and can't tell people to do with their kids, or how we should manage a society, what types of programs we should offer. Opportunity theories really avoid all of that because they really deal with very practical issues that don't really have any moral connotations to them, and they just aren't very political in nature. So looking at these theories, they would argue that each successfully completed criminal violation is going to, at the very least, require an offender who wants to commit the crime and who also has the ability to commit the crime. And ability might be an actual skill or ability that someone has, or it could just be the presence or absence of an opportunity to actually carry something out. When we look at routine activities theory, there are really a couple of different components that you need to be familiar with. The first thing they talk about is a motivated offender. And like I said earlier, these kinds of theories don't really deal with offender characteristics. The motivated offender is just an assumption. It's assumed that the motivated offender exists, and that wherever we are, there's an ample supply of motivated offenders to commit a crime given the opportunity to do so. So the theory itself doesn't really specify a motivated offender. It's just an assumption that is built into the theory. Beyond that, there are three elements of routine activities theory that you need to be familiar with. First, this theory specifies that you have to have something or someone that is a suitable target for a crime. And then the second element is there has to be an absence of guardians around that target. And when they talk about guardians, it could be the police, but that's not really what they mean in the theory. Guardians could be any variety of things. It could just be a large group of people around some particular location that no one wants to go commit a crime there because they don't want anyone to see them, or something like that. So the police certainly are one type of guardian, but certainly not the only type that they specify in this theory. So once you've got you have the motivated offender as an assumption, but once you have a suitable target, and then you have a lack of guardianship around that target, when those two things converge in time and space, then you have crime. So when you have the motivated offender, a suitable target, and a lack of guardianship all occurring at the same time in the same place, routine activities theory says that's when you get a criminal event. So looking at a little more detail here, the main thing that determines whether or not these elements are going to converge really is determined by the routine activities, hence the name of the theory, of people in their everyday lives. And if you think about it, if you live by yourself and you just stay in your house all day, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to be victimized by somebody. It's also pretty unlikely that you're going to commit any kind of serious violent crime. Once you leave your house, well, now that creates a whole new set of circumstances that opens you up to more possibilities than you have just sitting at home. So routine activities theory really argues that crime rates are not influenced by the people in our society who want to commit crime, because they always exist, but it's how society is organized and what kinds of activities we participate in that determine what is going to be happening to us. Just as kind of an example, so you understand what I'm talking about, there have been, where I'm doing my PhD studies at Georgia State University, every once in a while the police there will put out a notice that there was a robbery that occurred on campus. And almost always they involve a student who was on campus late at night or on the weekend or a holiday, who was walking down the street carrying their iPad or some other attractive electronic device just in their hand in the open. So this is a routine activities kind of an issue. When you're you're a suitable target because you're alone. There aren't very many people around. You've got this nice electronic device hanging out in the open that's easy to snatch and carry. It's just assumed that there are motivated offenders around. We don't have to worry about that. So we have the attractive target, we have a lack of guardianship, and so routine activities theory would say, well, of course you're going to have a crime because you have this convergence in time and space of these elements. So those are the kinds of fairly simple things that we're talking about. And one of the reasons that this theory argues that we see an increase in crime after World War II in our country is just because there was a big shift in people's routine activities where they did more things away from their home, whereas prior to that they pretty much stayed at home, and so they weren't as likely to be victimized. Routine activities theory, when it was first developed, really was a theory of victimization, not so much a theory of crime. It's evolved into more than that now, but initially the theory really just tried to explain why one person was more likely to be victimized than another, and it was explained in terms of these routine activities. And as routine activities shifted away from your home, it just became more likely that you would become a victim of various types of crime. So in looking at some other ideas that kind of mesh with this theory, rational choice theory and theories of low self-control are actually pretty compatible with a lot of the ideas embedded in routine activity theory. The idea that crime is less likely to occur if you don't have a suitable target, meaning that it's just not there's no attractive option. That's really a rational choice kind of idea, this kind of weighing of costs and benefits. But a lot of scholars will argue that, and do argue, that we need to not only look at the routine activities of victims, because a lot of times that's where we focus. We talk about, again, like the student on campus late at night with an iPad in their hand. That's a potential victim. But we also need to look at the routine activities of offenders, because offenders, as they go about their daily lives, they actually do play an active role in producing criminal events in various locations. So we can't just look only at the victims, although that's where this theory mostly started. We also have to look at the offenders. If we look at offenders as pleasure seekers, who just want to get some quick benefit and avoid any pain possible, that's kind of how we tend to view offenders in this group of theoretical ideas. And there is what we call offender search theory, which is a study of how the routines of potential offenders and how they select their targets. So it's not enough just to say, well, there's an attractive target, and this is really in an effort to get away from just the assumption of the motivated offender. A lot of people are wanting to say, well, we can probably explain maybe how offenders select their targets, because there's probably more than one attractive target in any given area. So the question is then, okay, so how do they pick which one they're actually going to victimize? One of the things that is totally absent from routine activities theory is any discussion of how we change the criminality or motivations of people. These theories just don't address that. So in other theories where we talk about, someone was under strain or they had low self-control or whatever, we don't worry about that at all in routine activity theory. And that's actually one of the things that makes this a fairly simple theory to understand, is that we're not really dealing with offender characteristics or the environment they grew up in. All we're talking about, we just kind of assume that there are offenders out there willing to commit crimes, and we don't really worry about why they're motivated to commit a crime. Routine activities theory says that the key to stopping crime is to prevent the intersection in time and space of offenders and suitable targets. So really, when you start talking about policy implications, This theory talks about just making crime more difficult by creating what they call defensible space. I mean, there are areas that we can we call it target hardening. There are things we can do in our defensible space to make crime less likely. Just as a simple example, you can put an alarm on your house. An alarm certainly won't prevent someone from breaking in if they really want to do it, but it might deter some people. They might just say, I'll just go find an easier target where I don't have to worry about that. And there are any number of ideas that you can come up with. And one of the ideas that's discussed is also crime prevention through environmental design. And this is an idea that's been incorporated into areas such as architecture. One of the things I've heard discussed is entrances to buildings. Instead of making the doorways square with corners that someone could hide behind as someone walks up towards the entrance, you make those walls really round, so there's nowhere for anyone to hide. And so that's how we talk about crime prevention through environmental design. You just design a building so that there aren't any hiding spaces around it, so the people walking by that building are less likely to be victimized. So in looking at policy implications that flow from routine activities theory, what we're really talking about is taking steps to increase the effort needed to commit a crime, increase the risks of attempting to commit the crime, and reducing the rewards. So again, a very rational choice type of idea. Felsen argued that blocking opportunities can be heightened through three strategies. The first is natural strategies, which deals with how we design space. And this is what I was talking about earlier, where designing buildings so that there are no hiding spaces around them. Instead of building buildings with dark alleyways between them, eliminate that so that the offenders can't go down dark alleyways and victimize people that walk by, things like that. There are organizational strategies, which would involve things like hiring security guards for the express purpose of guarding a particular location. And then there are what they call mechanical strategies, which is just alarms, cameras, other kinds of things like that. Put bars on your windows. There's things that mechanically prevent someone from committing a crime. Locking the doors on your car, something like that. A researcher named Eck actually added some ideas to routine activities theory, and he added what he called controllers. And he sees crime as the intersection of offenders and targets in a particular place. And each of the three elements specified in routine activities theory, if you look at figure 13.1 in your book, it demonstrates this. Have what Eck called controllers. So, and this just means that the offender and the target and the place all have people that are kind of in charge of what's going on with that person or place or thing. And it's the influence of these controllers that can also have an impact on crime. So, in the terminology used by Eck, offenders have handlers. That might be a parent or friends or whatever. Targets, or the victims, have guardians, and places have managers. So this is the terminology that Eck used. And the influence of these handlers, or controllers, can also influence how often crime occurs or doesn't occur. Most of the people that advocate opportunity reduction usually look mostly at ideas and strategies that don't involve the use of the police. But the police have implemented in many areas what they call problem-oriented policing, which can be very effective. And it's really where you just kind of identify a particular problem in a certain area, and then use strategies to make those certain crimes more difficult to commit. One of the things the police do a lot in this area is, like with drug areas. If drug dealers are hiding in the shadows in an apartment complex, well, then you just put police officers in that apartment complex and they patrol the hallways. And, then you kind of reduce that problem. In general, the research on situational crime prevention are pretty supportive of the idea that this really does reduce crime. One of the things you have to look at when you start talking about these sorts of crime prevention strategies is what we call the displacement effect. So let's say that you take some kind of measures in some area, regardless of what it is, to prevent crime. You say you install windows or bars on all the windows, you put alarms on all the houses, you make everybody lock their cars. So you make this one particular area, let's say, really difficult, to commit a crime in. So what the displacement effect is that, well, maybe you reduce crime in this area, but the question is then, does that crime just never occur, or does it actually just happen somewhere else? Because an offender might look at a particular target and say, well, this is no good, I'll just go over here and do it over here where it's easier. So that's what we call crime displacement, because it's good to reduce crime in one area, but if all that crime really just moved to another area, then we really haven't accomplished that much. We still have the same amount of crime occurring, we just moved it from one place to another, so that's not really the best outcome. It's really unlikely, though, that 100% of the crimes we prevent are displaced. It seems unlikely that every single offender would decide to move if it's too hard to do it here. Some are going to, for sure, but probably not all of them. So let's just say we reduce burglaries in a particular neighborhood by, say, 10 burglaries. Well, if 10 of those burglaries that didn't occur, let's say half of the offenders decided they were going to do it somewhere else. So that means 5 burglaries occurred in some other neighborhood that might have been somewhere else. So we have to look at this to say, you could say, well, we reduced burglary by 10 in this neighborhood, but if it increased by 5 somewhere else because of your efforts, then your net reduction really is only 5 burglaries. So you have to take that into account when you're looking at the benefits of these types of policies. Moving on to rational choice theory, some of the most influential researchers in this area have been 3 guys by the name of Derek, Cornish, and Clark. And Cornish and Clark in particular have had a lot of influence on some changes to deterrence theory. But when we look at rational choice theories, some of the more modern versions of them, what we start looking at is crime control not so much through state sanctions and official sanctions, but through more informal means. And situational crime prevention can be one of them. And then there are some other ideas we'll talk about. So under rational choice theory, the motivation to commit a crime is an important component for giving someone the idea that they want to commit a crime in the first place. But rational choice theory also talks about how crime involves a concrete choice or a sequence of choices that someone has to make in order for their motivation to commit a crime to actually result in a crime being committed. Because a lot of people might get the idea about committing a crime, but if they don't actually make the choice to follow through on it, then nothing's going to happen. Rational choice theory takes seriously the study of how offenders think, so that we can try to predict where and when criminal events will occur. One of the concepts you need to be familiar with that is a kind of a modern addition to rational choice theory is the idea of bounded rationality. If you remember from earlier discussions from the classical school of criminology, Rational choice theories usually assumed that offenders were rational, meaning that they gathered all the necessary information, they weighed the costs and benefits, and then they made a choice. Well, nowadays we talk more about what's called bounded rationality, which just means we recognize that nobody makes a decision with all of the relevant information. And you can see this in your own lives, I'm sure. We make decisions based on the best information we have available, and we may even recognize that there are things that we don't know that would be nice to know, but we can't, find them out. And so we make decisions based on this bounded rationality. It's this weighing of costs and benefits, within the confines of the imperfect information that we have. And so that's the conception of offenders that's used more nowadays, because I don't think anybody can really successfully argue that all decisions are made with all the relevant information all the time. We make decisions based on incomplete information, and we kind of make our best guess. So looking at policy implications that flow from rational choice, one of the ideas that's come out of it is what we've talked about before, about the severity of punishments being increased quite a bit. Because especially through the 1980s, there was this idea that everybody was responsible for their own actions. And so if people decide to do things that we don't like as a society, well, then we should just punish them severely. Now with situational crime prevention, that's another policy implication. By studying how offenders make decisions to commit crime and where they do it and when, we can take steps to reduce the opportunities. So that's another possible policy implication that we've already discussed at length with routine activities theory. But the danger of rational choice theory is that we only treat offenders as decision makers, and that's it. Because like I said before, we don't take into account anything about their life circumstances, their growing up situation, or whatever. We simply just assume that they exist, and we only treat them as decision makers, and that can bring some problems on its own. The core of rational choice theory is that offenders are rational. And again, we use this idea of bounded rationality nowadays. But if we look at decision making as a process, it's actually pretty complex. I mean, there are a lot of factors that go into trying to explain why someone makes the choices they do. Wright and Decker show, it was some research that they did, that offenders do make a series of choices about whether or not they're going to offend, which targets to victimize, how to carry out the crime, and how to avoid being detected by the police or anybody else. So it has been shown that there is a decision-making process that occurs. And that might seem like just kind of stating the obvious, but showing that in research highlights the need to analyze this decision-making process. One of the theories that falls under the rational choice genre is deterrence theory. And you probably remember the classical school version of deterrence theory, where it was the swiftness of punishment, the certainty of punishment, and the severity of punishment that would determine whether or not someone engaged in a crime. Some updates that have been made to deterrence theory have caused it to be renamed Perceptual deterrence theory. And this theory is just a slight modification from the early deterrence theory. It's because if you remember, early deterrence theory talked about, well, offenders will weigh the costs and benefits, and they'll commit the crime if the benefits outweigh the costs. Well, with this idea of bounded rationality, we have to recognize that people probably don't always know for sure the risk of being caught, the benefits of actually succeeding. Just to give you an example, when I was a police officer, every once in a while we'd have someone break into the coin box on those vacuum cleaners that you see like at car washes and stuff. Well, I think that people believed that if they broke in there, they'd get $50 or $60 worth of quarters and they could go on their way. The reality was that those machines probably had anywhere from $2 to $5 in them at night because they were emptied every night. And so if they believed there was $50 in there, they were wrong. But again, it's it's the perception that matters, though, not the actual fact. The fact that there was only $5 in the vacuum machine didn't really matter because the offender perceived that there was much more than that. So we can see that they were wrong, but this perception they had is what caused them to commit the crime. Because probably if you'd have told them, there's only $3 in there, most people are going to move on and go somewhere else because $3 isn't really worth it, I would think. So it's the perception of costs and benefits, not the actual costs and benefits, that actually matter in terms of analyzing whether or not someone will commit a crime. So perceptual deterrence theory is different from rational choice theory in really three ways. It does not assume complete rationality. Again, it uses this idea of bounded rationality. And the traditional deterrence theory really just focused on legal punishments, getting caught by the police, getting arrested, possibly going to jail, those kinds of things. Perceptual deterrence theory really looks at sanctions and punishments outside of just the legal realm, more informal types of things, like is your girlfriend going to hate you if she finds out, those kinds of things. The only thing is that the policy proposals from perceptual deterrence theory aren't really clear, because if you look at the old classical version of deterrence theory, the answer was very simple. You just make crime cost more to commit by increasing sanctions, and that was the answer. Perceptual deterrence theory is a little harder because the question becomes, how do you change people's perceptions? How do you make them perceive lower benefits to committing crime and higher costs? And that's a different question, and it's harder to accomplish. And it's not entirely clear how you would do it. But perceptual deterrence theory really arose because of the weaknesses in the traditional deterrence theory. And I think I've already mentioned some of those, that the actual risk of being caught isn't really the issue at hand. It's what people think their chances are of getting caught, their perception of their chances of getting caught that matters. And then we also have this idea that some people might not really care if they get arrested because they perceive that any punishment they receive is going to be minimal or nothing. And that may or may not be the case. But it's these perceptions that really matter. Early studies on deterrence theory tended to show that the certainty of punishment was the most important factor. But there was really some methodological flaws in those studies, and they were usually only bivariate, which is not a very sophisticated method of analysis. And so the results of those really aren't as solid as they were once thought to be. And so, this idea that the certainty and the swiftness and severity of punishment is the way to affect crime really has lost a lot of ground because, if you look at how severe punishments have gotten in this country, if that worked, we'd have no crime. But clearly we still do, even though we've increased the severity and certainty quite a bit. So, these weaknesses in deterrence theory really became evident as we started to see that the policies that came from it really didn't work that well. In addition to the cost of getting arrested, there are also other perceptions that have to be taken into account. There are non-legal costs. getting arrested can be embarrassing, and some people will do whatever they can to just avoid being arrested because they just don't want the embarrassment. There are also what we call commitment and attachment costs. These are things like, if I get arrested and I go to jail, my employer will find out and I'll lose my job. Or if I get arrested, my girlfriend will find out and she'll break up with me. So those kinds of costs, they're more informal kinds of costs, also need to be considered. So what perceptual deterrence theory tries to do is take into account how people form perceptions of the costs of committing crime and the benefits of committing crime, and then how those perceptions influence their actual behavior. One of the things that is seen in some research is what we call resetting. So to give you an example of how this works, and it's actually kind of problematic, let's say someone commits an offense 10 times, and on number 11 they get caught. Well, after that number 11, they'll think to themselves, well, I did it 10 times, and I didn't get caught, and I got caught this time, I guess that was bound to happen. So I'm probably good for another 10 before I get caught again. So in their mind, the odds of them getting caught have kind of reset by the fact that they got caught one time. And now that, again, may or may not actually be the case, but they perceive it that way. And so because they perceive that these odds have been reset, it actually increases their offending in the future because they believe now that they've got a little while to go before they get caught again. So these kinds of things are very problematic. Warren Stafford argued that there are four really main sources of our perceptions when it comes to the costs of crime. One is direct punishment. That's punishment that is applied directly to you because you got caught. There's also indirect punishment, and that is when you see someone else get punished because they got caught. Then there's also avoidance of punishment, and we have both direct and indirect avoidance here as well. So direct avoidance of punishment would be if you go out and commit a crime and you don't get caught. You avoided the punishment and you got away with it, so that's direct avoidance of punishment. Indirect avoidance of punishment is when you see someone else commit a crime and they don't get caught. So that's going to affect your perception of the likelihood of getting caught as well. So these four things are argued to really kind of influence the perceptions of the costs and benefits of crime, and particularly the likelihood of getting caught and the likelihood of being punished. Our current perceptions of the risk of being punished are based both on the perceptions we've had in the past and on newly acquired information that we get all the time. So one of the problems with trying to test this idea of perceptions, or at least developing policies from it, is that perceptions aren't just static. They change all the time, and as we go through life experiences, our perceptions of getting caught or not getting caught or whatever will change over time, and so we have to find a way to get them to change in the right direction. So one of the things that scholars are now talking about quite a bit is that we need to emphasize certainty over severity when it comes to punishment. Because over the last 30 years or so, we've really emphasized severity. Some of the ways that they've tried to do this are a couple of ideas. The main policy that's usually highlighted quite often in criminology theory books is Project Hope, which is a probation program in Hawaii. And I won't go into detail, but essentially you can read more about it in your book. But Project Hope they try to use a high degree of certainty of getting punished for infractions of probation. But the punishments are not necessarily overly severe. They're small punishments, but the idea is that they use certainty. And the way they do this is with very intense monitoring, having people come in frequently for drug tests and alcohol tests, and there's a lot of reporting requirements that people have, but they've tried to find ways to increase certainty over severity. And looking at police practices, people have started to focus more now on police practices that increase the certainty of arrest rather than severity of punishment, because just the idea of getting arrested, even if the punishment is small, is something that most people would usually like to try to avoid. The last theory that this section talks about in your book is called situational action theory. And this theory is somewhat more complex than some of the other rational choice-based theories. And honestly, this theory is not really a pure rational choice type of theory. There are a lot of ideas that are involved in it. But this theory tries to explain why someone sees crime as an action alternative and then actually choose to carry it out. And to give you an example of what I mean, if someone sees a car sitting in front of a QT with the engine running and nobody's in it, some people see that as an opportunity to steal a car. Other people don't. Probably most of you don't, but some people do. And so what this theory tries to explain in part is, why does one person see that as an opportunity to steal a car and another person doesn't? And one of the ways the theory tries to explain that is by invoking the use of morality. And it's not like a religious kind of morality. It's just this idea of just kind of a basic conception of right versus wrong. And so it argues that crime is really a moral form of action, and the decision to commit a crime occurs within some context that has a moral quality. And so that's where we get the term situational action theory. It's that every decision to commit a crime, this theory argues, has some situational context. It depends on who the person's with, maybe who's around watching, what that person's personal conception of right versus wrong is, and all of those things will kind of combine to determine whether or not that person is going to commit that crime or not. So in situational action theory, the choice of whether or not to commit a crime really starts with someone experiencing a motivation to commit some crime. And then there's a moral filter that affects what someone sees as, actual choices they could make or versus not. And this is that idea, again, that some people would see an unoccupied car as a chance to steal it, other people don't. And this theory argues that it's this moral filter that some people have that just kind of screens some of those things out, and they don't see that as an opportunity to commit a crime. So there is kind of a rational deliberation that takes place, but it's really, in situational action theory, this deliberation really occurs more in the context of right versus wrong, versus not necessarily cost versus benefits. Wickstrom also argues that there are systemic factors and life history factors that can be important. But he also says in his theory that these background variables, like things like socioeconomic class, race, sex, all those kinds of things, parenting practices, that those things are only important to the extent that they influence the variables in situational action theory. And the key variables in situational action theory are self-control and morality. And so what Wickstrom argues is that all those background variables, they don't directly affect your propensity to commit crime. They affect your level of self-control, and they affect your level of morality. And so it's then those levels of self-control and morality that kind of interact to determine what the likelihood is that you will commit any particular crime. The core construct of situational action theory, which is criminal propensity, only conceives of morality as whether an act is seen as wrong. Other definitions are much more complex, and self-control and morality, interact together in this theory. There are a couple of important contributions this theory has made, and this is a relatively new theory. It's only been around for maybe 8 or 10 years, which is new in criminology. But one is that the choice of crime can't be reduced to a simple calculation of costs and benefits. There's a whole lot more going on than that. And people's individual morality, certainly plays into this decision process. But it also illustrates the importance of seeing choices as being situational. I mean, there's a context, surrounding these choices, and someone might make, in evaluating the very same crime, they may make a different decision in one situation versus another, just because of different, factors that exist at the time. Just to wrap things up for this chapter, and I know this is a long chapter, there were a lot of things that are in this, but routine activities theory, rational choice, perceptual deterrence, and then to some extent situational action theory. And these are the major concepts and theories you really need to be familiar with coming out of this chapter. So looking at the concluding points that we have here, one is that the concern of these theories is largely with the present and with the crime-inducing factors that are proximate or closest to the criminal act that is about to occur. So we're not so concerned about was someone victimized 10 years ago and how does that affect their criminal propensity now. We're really looking at what's going on right now in terms of these theories. Theories of choice and opportunity are reminders that offenders are active decision makers, and they shape this process quite a bit. They're not just passive participants breaking the law. We also need to consider how the decision to offend is affected by perceptions of costs and benefits. Remember, it's not just the actual costs and benefits, because most people don't really know that with any degree of accuracy. It's what they perceive costs and benefits to be. And then situational factors will come into play, such as how attractive a target is, and whether or not there are the presence of guardians or controllers at any particular time. So these theories have important policy implications, and they are mostly focused on reducing the opportunity to offend, rather than looking at changing the offender. It's kind of assumed in these theories that offenders will always exist. There's not much we can do about that, but we can reduce the opportunity for these crimes to occur. So if you have any questions about any of this, please get in touch with me, and I'll be talking to you soon.